Good morning. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to the book of Acts, chapter 23. The book of Acts, chapter 23. And I want to do something a little bit different today, just because of the flow of this text we're looking at. We're going to look at the entire 23rd chapter of the book of Acts. And so don't get nervous. We're probably going to move through it maybe more quickly than you would even like, but what I want you to try to focus in on is one particular verse in Acts 23, and then try to think of the entire chapter in light of that verse. So we'll get there in just a second. If you could go ahead and look it up. I want you to kind of take a journey with me, if you could, mentally. We're going to go back in time, quite some time actually. You and I are, it seems kind of like the desert here in Arizona is sort of the surrounding, but we're not in Arizona. And we're walking together, and we've come upon a hole in the ground, basically. And we wouldn't necessarily think anything odd, except we kind of hear something in the hole in the ground that's not dirt or rock. And so we sort of peer out over the edge, and we notice there's a figure in the hole. It's a person. And they're obviously distressed. They're very much distraught. We can hear it in the sounds they're making. We can see it as we focus and look at the facial expression. About this time, we hear some other people approaching the hole, so we sort of get out of the way. And some other people come as well, and they all converge in this hole. And they pull this person out of the hole. It's a guy. And basically, one group sells the person to another group. Just sells it to them. Takes some money, gives it to them. And we watch as they grab this guy, and then one group that just bought him just sort of fades off into the distance with him. We're immediately kind of transported there to another land. We're in Egypt, and we see this guy with these people that bought him at the hole in the ground. And another guy who looks like he's probably of some prestige, his name's Potiphar, buys the guy from them as sort of a slave in his house. And while this is happening, somehow the physical realm is kind of ripped away for us, and we see a spiritual dynamic that's going on. And we realize that in the midst of this person being sold into slavery, that God is with them. Now, in the physical realm, we don't see God anywhere near this situation. Right? From everything we see with our physical eyes, this just looks bad in any way you cut it. And it is bad. It's not good. But even in the midst of the badness, God has not abandoned this person. He's with him. We kind of then sort of fast forward. We see this guy sort of rise in stature in this Egyptian's house, Potiphar. He basically is elevated to where he's in charge of the entire estate, only under Potiphar's authority. And Potiphar's wife is not a very nice person, and she sort of persistently tries to seduce this person into immorality. And he, by God's grace, persistently rejects her advances, until one day it comes to such a climax that she is basically trying to physically grab him for seduction, and he runs away. And she's got his cloak, and he's gone. So, not wanting to look like she's the person who tried to seduce him, she begins to cry out, says he tried to seduce her. And of course, when Potiphar comes home, and this is his wife, and hears her story, he basically goes with her version of the events, even though Joseph is the guy we're talking about, was really second in command in his house, and Potiphar puts him in prison. And in prison, so he's gone from sold into slavery to going through the ranks to now in prison. Kind of another hole, if you will, in the ground. And somehow, as we're watching him in prison, the physical realm is ripped away again, And once again, we're reminded that even though this is bad, this person, Potiphar's wife, lied, tried to seduce him, framed him. We know the true version of events here, and they're not what she's saying. Yet in the midst of all of that, God is with him. God's with him. So it's not good, but God's working even in the midst of it. There's a couple of guys in prison, and they have some dreams, and God gives Joseph insight on what those dreams mean. Lo and behold, just as the Lord revealed to Joseph, obviously those things come to pass. And when one of these people is taken out of the prison and restored to their role, the other's taken out and executed. It says that the person that got out, and Joseph wanted them to remember him when they got out of prison, they got out and they forgot him. And then just a few verses in the text you and I might gloss over really quickly. And it's sad that we do, but it's how we read the Bible sometimes, I think. We just gloss over things. It says, this guy forgot Joseph, and 2 whole years went by. Now, press the pause button there. 2 years. Okay? We're now, if that's our time, we're in May of 2019. No, we're 2020. Sorry, I'm not a mathematician. 2020. Okay? 2 years. 2 Christmases, right? 2 Super Bowls. Okay? Just kind of get the picture in your mind. We just gloss over that. This is a long period of time. This guy's just left in prison. The reason why I'm mentioning that to you is we can go throughout the pages of the Bible and we can find time and time and time again, not just the story of Joseph at the end of the book of Genesis, but several people we could identify where God was clearly at work in their life in unbelievable, difficult circumstances that from the surface did not look good in any way you cut it, but the spiritual reality was very different than what you saw on the surface. And that God was at work. He had not abandoned them. So with that in mind, I want to show you another one. Okay? So now we're in Acts 23, and I want you to look with me at verse 11. Now we're going to read this one verse, and then we're going to kind of move through chapter 23 pretty quickly. But in verse 11 of Acts 23, it says, the following night, the Lord stood by him. And this him, this person referred to here, is Paul. The Lord stood by him and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, which is where Paul is at the time, so you must testify also in Rome. All right? This is the spiritual reality. And now we're going to look at sort of the physical as we look at the chapter as a whole. But don't lose sight of this. In fact, Pastor Matt's been preaching through the book of Acts, right? We know from the chapters before this, Paul is in Jerusalem. He's in the temple. A mob seizes him. He's arrested. He tries to say what's going on here and proclaim about what God's doing through the work of Christ in his life and the life of others. People don't buy it. They're about ready to beat him. Then the guy realizes he's a Roman citizen, so they're not going to beat him, okay? I mean, we're talking about major roller coaster going on here in the last few chapters, a couple of chapters we're looking at. And now we're here, and basically if you read the last few verses of chapter 22, this Roman leader is trying to figure out what's going on with Paul that he's in such a mess with these people, these Jewish leaders. And so he decides to take Paul before the Jewish council, right? And he's saying, all right, go talk to these people. These are the leaders of your people. So we know the spiritual reality from verse 11, that God's with him, and God's telling him, take courage. You've testified before me in Jerusalem. You're going to do so in Rome. All right? I've not abandoned you. I'm standing with you in the midst of this. So what's going on around him? Well, let's start at verse 23. So he's brought before the council. Paul looks intently at the council, it says in verse 1. And Paul says to the council, these are the Jewish rulers, right? Sadducees, Pharisees, chief priests. These are the guys that, for whatever political freedom the Jewish people have at this point under Roman rule, these guys exercise that power. This is their jurisdiction. All right? So Paul is brought before this council, and he says, brothers, I've lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. So Paul begins to speak, I've lived my life before God to this day, and he's slapped. Right? Not a very good response to his opening statement. Okay? And Paul, when this happens, said, God's going to strike you. Seems like a pretty bold response, right? You whitewashed wall. Press the pause button. Does that sound familiar to you if you're familiar with Jesus' interaction with some religious leaders in the Gospels? That's kind of his words, right? Read Matthew 23, a scathing rebuke of some religious leaders. We call it the woes. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, all of you. You're like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, inside full of dead men's bones and all corruption. It's exactly the same thing Paul says to these guys. You whitewashed wall, are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck? Referring back to Leviticus, where when people are brought before the council or the Jewish leaders, they're to be treated fairly. He's just getting up, making an opening statement, and they're already obviously passing judgment on him. So he said, you're judging me by the law, and you're violating the law as you do it. And those who stood by said, you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I don't know, brothers. I did not know that he was the high priest, for it's written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now, we don't know if Paul just didn't see the guy. Maybe he's got poor eyesight. Or maybe he's not functioning like a godly high priest, so, hey, I didn't recognize he was the high priest. We're not sure how to exactly take what Paul says here, but the reality is it seems pretty clear that Paul is following God faithfully, and those who are opposing him are really opposing not just him, but God's work in and through him. And so Paul rebukes them in this situation, which, by the way, Ananias is the high priest's name, right? If you go back to chapter 9, when Paul meets Jesus on the Damascus Road, who does God send to Paul to kind of lay hands on him and pray for him? What was his name? Anybody remember? He's a Christian. Ananias, right? Some people kind of wonder if Luke is sort of helping us remember that situation. And the idea would be one of irony and one of important recollection in light of verse 11. Here's what I mean. Irony, two Ananiases lay hands on Paul. One knows God and recognizes what God's doing in his life, and actually Paul receives sight. The other Ananias clearly is not in line with God and strikes him to the face to oppose the very ministry he's called to in chapter 9. You can't get more opposite people with the same name in the book of Acts here. Another thing is, when Ananias is going to go lay hands on Paul, it's very clear, you can read this in Acts chapter 9, that when God's calling Paul, he's calling Paul to testify to the gospel before all people, Jews and Gentiles. Now, he's testifying before the Jews here, but through the course of events that's going to happen with his arrest and all these things, he's going to eventually appeal to Caesar. And by the end of the book of Acts, he's going to be in Rome testifying to the gospel. So maybe another reason why Ananias comes here is not just one was in line with God, laid hands on Paul and received a sight. The other's not in line with God, quote, lays hands on Paul to oppose him. But it's also remembering that, hey, none of this is happening by chance. This is bad situations. These people are violating what God desires, but God has not abandoned him in the midst of it. And God's working in the midst of it. Now, when Paul perceived, verse 6, that one part were Sadducees, one part of the council were Sadducees, the other part were Pharisees, he cried out in the council, brother, I am a Pharisee, son of Pharisees, and it is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. Now, well, look what Luke says. And when he said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection. And that's kind of the little joke, right? They don't believe there's a resurrection, so they're sad, you see. Okay, maybe you'll catch that sometime. So they don't believe in the resurrection, they're sad, you see. And so Paul knows this, right? And so he says, hey, I'm on hope here. I'm on trial. I believe in the resurrection. So he's like saying, Pharisees, you guys know where I'm coming from. Sadducees really don't like that. So they actually break out in a fight among themselves while Paul's standing there. And so Luke tells us in verse 8, the Sadducees say there's no resurrection, there's no angels, there's no spirits. But the Pharisees acknowledged them all, and a great clamor arose. Some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply, hey, we find nothing wrong with this man. And what if a spirit or angel spoke to him? Well, clearly the Sadducees don't believe that because they don't believe in angels or spirits, right? And by the way, it wasn't an angel or spirit that showed up to Paul, it was Jesus himself. So they're really off base too. So they're kind of fighting among themselves, and neither one of them's right in terms of what really is happening in Paul's life. And when the dissension became violent, by the way, if you remember the previous chapters, there's all kind of violence erupting around Paul at this time. I mean, it's chaos, okay? But in the midst of all that, God's at work. It became violent. The tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces. Now, did you catch that? I mean, this is not like, hey, look, I disagree with you, man. No, really, you disagree with me? Well, what about them? They're not having a civil debate. This is a violent outbreak of dissension. They're afraid Paul's going to get ripped to pieces in the midst of this thing. So he commanded the soldiers to go down, take him from among them by force, and bring him to the barracks. And by the way, that's where we get to verse 11. So he's in the midst of all of this. He's in the barracks now. It doesn't look like a good situation physically from any way you look at it. But if we could peel away the physical realm and look at what's going on spiritually, God is standing by Paul. He's not abandoning him. And he says, take courage. You're going to testify here. You've done that. And you will do this in Rome as well. So while it looks physically like everything's going sideways, and God, where are you? Right? You ever been there? God's right there. That's where he is. He's right there. So I think probably a primary takeaway for us is that when God is working in our lives, pain and problems come. And it can look like it goes sideways really, really fast. And we can be tempted, I think, in those times to wonder, where is God? And even though we may not feel it, he's right there. He's not abandoning you. He's not forsaken you. He's with you, standing by you. In fact, you remember when Saul, right, is persecuting Christians and Jesus shows up to him? What does Jesus say to him? Why are you persecuting me? It seems that Jesus takes personal what people do to his church because it's his body. And so when Paul is in the midst of this chaos, violent conflict, God's with him. That doesn't mean that the chaos immediately subsides and now he's tiptoeing through the daisies and everything's wonderful physically. It's still a bad situation. But inside, there can be a peace and a power and a courage that doesn't come from us. This doesn't come from us. This comes from Christ with us. Christ with us. It's his power. So even in the midst of all that, God is with him. So let's keep going. So because you might think, okay, awesome. He got the spiritual truth, right? God's with him. He heard Jesus say, take courage. He knows now that there's a plan at work. He's testified in Jerusalem. He's going to do it in Rome. Everything's awesome, right? Can we now get to the end of the book and everybody lives happily ever after? Actually, it's not what happens in the text. Look at verse 12. Kind of goes from bad to worse, okay? When it was day, so he's spent the night in these barracks, right? That's when the Lord showed up to him. When it's day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they killed Paul. Right? So, hey, come over here. Yeah. Are you in on this? Sure, I'm in on it. Yeah, I'm serious, man. Are you serious? Absolutely, I'm serious. In fact, come on, let's do it. We're not going to eat again until he's dead. Okay, they're serious. Right? I mean, that's serious. They're not going to eat again until he's dead. So there was more than 40 people who made this pact, this conspiracy together. And they went to the chief priests and the elders, kind of these people in the council, and they said, look, we've strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we've killed Paul. We're not eating again till he's dead. Now therefore, along with the council, give notice to the tribune, this Roman leader, to bring Paul down to you as though you're going to determine his case more exactly. So go to the Roman guy, tell him to bring Paul down like you're going to have the council again so you can hear him more. But all this is a setup. They're just trying to get Paul out of the barracks so that when he's out of the barracks and making his way to the council, they would then kill him before he gets there. That's the plan. Now, the son of Paul's sister, press the pause button. We hear very little of Paul's family, right? Right here, we hear a sister. This is nephew then, right? Paul's sister's nephew. So I don't know what he's doing there. I don't know how he got to overhear all this. We're not told all that. But we are told that the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told this to Paul. So here's something else. The Lord stood by Paul and just gave him this message directly in the barracks. Sometimes God just uses people to send a message to us, right? I mean, God could have just told this to Paul. But he didn't. He kind of used what we might consider very natural means. A family member hears about what's going on, obviously very concerned for their family member, and goes to Paul and says, you need to know about this. So they tell Paul, and Paul calls one of the centurions and said, look, take this young man to the tribune, the leader. He has something to tell him. So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, hey, Paul the prisoner called me and asked me to take this young man to you. He has something to say to you. So the tribune kind of hears what's going on and says, all right. So he takes the guy by the hand, he takes him aside privately, and he says, what's up? And the young man says, the guy says, what do you have to tell me? So the young man says, verse 20, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow as though they're going to inquire somewhat more closely about him, but don't be persuaded by them. More than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him and who have bound themselves by an oath not to eat nor drink till they've killed him. And now they're ready. They're waiting for your consent. So the guy's telling him what's going to happen before it happens so that he knows this is all the setup. They just want him dead. So the tribune dismissed the young man, telling him, don't tell anyone that you told me about this. Then he called, now check this out, 2 centurions and said, get ready, 200, now do the math with me. You know I'm bad at math, what I just said at the beginning of the message, so help me out here. 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen. So what's the total there? How much? 470. The Roman cohort in Jerusalem probably would have been about 1,000 personnel. This guy is almost calling up half of the entire Roman military force in Jerusalem. He's pretty serious at this point, right? I mean, this is about half of his military personnel for one task. And what's he calling all these people together for? To go as far as Caesarea at the 3rd hour of night, so it's about 9 o'clock at night they're going to take off. And to provide mounts for Paul to ride and to bring him safely to Phoenix, the governor. Basically what he says is, no, they're not going to kill him. So he calls 470 military personnel, roughly about half of what he has available to him. At 9 o'clock at night, they get Paul together and they march him out of there. So I don't think the ambush of 40 people is going to put much of a dent in half of the Roman military personnel at this place at 9 o'clock at night to make sure that their ambush and conspiracy doesn't happen. Here's the thing. God used a nephew to help kind of give some insight in what's going on. God now uses Roman personnel to get him out of there safely. So sometimes God just shows up in the middle of the night. Other times he uses what we might call more natural means, but it's nevertheless God working providentially through these things to fulfill his purpose for Paul's life. Okay? The bottom line is the common denominator in both ways is that God is the one that's at work. He's not abandoned Paul, and he's going to fulfill his purpose for him. Okay, so they're going to send him away, and now we get the letter that the Roman leader's sending with Paul. And by the way, we hear about this tribune, now we actually know his name. Look here, Claudius Lysias. Every time I read, isn't that a classic Roman name? Who are you? Claudius Lysias. I mean, that just not like Pete Sharpentay. It's that seems like a anyway. Okay. Claudius Lysias, to His Excellence the Governor Felix, greetings. This man, that's Paul, was seized by the Jews, about to be killed by them, when I came upon them with soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. Now, notice what the things he doesn't say, scholars say. He doesn't say he almost beat him when he's a Roman citizen. He leaves all those conveniently out of the description, right, of what's going on. But he says, desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council and found that he was being accused about questions of their law and charged with nothing deserving of death or imprisonment, nothing the Romans would execute someone for. So when it was disclosed to me that there was a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. So that's going to bring us to the next chapter, when then Paul's not going to have to give his defense for these other guys. So that's the letter they're sending, explaining why this guy is being marched out of Jerusalem to this other place, and why he's being brought. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul, brought him by night to Antipatris, and on the next day they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. And when they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. And on reading the letter, he asked what province he was from. And when he learned he was from Cilicia, he said, well, okay, I'm going to give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. You say, why would Luke include all of this in Acts chapter 23? That's why I wanted to direct you to verse 11 first. Because I think in the midst of all of this sort of Luke just describing what's going on in Paul's life, there's a spiritual dynamic that's being fulfilled that if you focus on the physical realm, you might totally miss. But we know God's standing with Paul. We know God's fulfilling the purpose he has for Paul all the way back in chapter 9. We're seeing it unfolded now. And we know that it's very bad things. I mean, these people are not aligned with God, that are opposing him. They're not handling his case justly. It's not a good situation, physically. But God is not abandoning him. So just to repeat again, when you and I think, go through things that seem like it's going sideways really fast, by God's grace, to remember that God's at work, I think is crucial. Because I think when we're tempted to cry out, not just tempted, when we actually do cry out, the Lord stands with us. And by the way, this was not the first time, nor this is not the last time this happens in Paul's life. If you read 2 Timothy chapter 4, the last letter we know that Paul wrote in Scripture, Paul kind of at the end of that chapter goes through the list of people. And some of them have not interacted well with him. And Paul basically says that when I stood kind of at this defense, he's talking about in that chapter, he said, no one stood with me, but the Lord stood with me. Isn't that awesome news? That the truth of the gospel is that we can rest in Christ's promise and power and presence in our lives, no matter what we face. And it doesn't just kind of wipe everything away. Okay? That truth is planted right in the midst of a narrative that's really chaotic. When you read the book of Revelation, a lot of people read Revelation for a whole bunch of reasons. I would encourage you as you read the book of Revelation to pay attention to this. When you get scenes of what's going on earth, it looks like the world is just literally ripping apart at the seams. And then, in the book of Revelation, at various points, you get a glimpse into heaven in the midst of all this chaos on earth. And you know what you find in heaven? God's not up there going, man, I don't know what to do. Like, do you see what's going on down there? This is crazy. That's never the response you get. The response you get is people are worshiping a sovereign God who reigns in absolute majestic power. It's not that he's unaware of what's going on. He's fulfilling his purpose even in the midst of the chaos. And he is the one that then provides by his power the peace, the truth we need that gives us a compass to navigate the chaos. Because we know that he's going to fulfill his purposes. Plain and simple. So my prayer for us today is, as we kind of think about this chapter is, and we'll go into a time right now where we can kind of prayerfully respond, is I want you to just pray that God would help us, if you know Christ, to remember by his grace that he's with you in the midst of the chaos. If you don't know Christ, my prayer is that God will open your eyes to the fact that without him, you are in the chaos. And as you stand there, it will rip you to shreds. Because we're no match for it in ourselves. But Christ has conquered. And through his victory, we have victory. Not in ourselves, but in him. Jesus told his disciples, in the world you will have trouble. But take heart, I've already overcome it. Okay? Paul, he's in the world, there's trouble. Take heart, Christ stands with him. And my prayer for you is that if you don't know him, Christ offers himself to you today for you to stand in his victory. I need to make a confession to you. When I first became a believer, I was not raised in church. I didn't come to know Christ in my teenage years. So when I started reading the Bible, this was really the first time I was reading these stories. And my confession to you is when I was reading the Old Testament, and I would read various stories of people in the Old Testament, and God would tell them, I'm with you, I'm with you, I'm with you. And that's kind of God's promise to them. I would respond to that in my mind, of course, and I would say, man, God, you can't come up with something better than that. I mean, like, something a little bit more sensational and just, I'm with you. I mean, what about? The more I've walked with the Lord, the more I realize I need to repent of that thought. Because here's why. When God gives you himself, there is nothing greater that can be given. God is not a means to an end. He's the means and the end. He's everything. And so when God tells these guys, I am with you, there's nothing more that really needs to be said at that point. Because there's nothing greater that can come your way. The Lord is my shepherd, David said. So what? I don't need anything. I don't need anything. When I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, what does David say? You are with me. When Jesus is coming, right, to take on flesh, he shall be called Emmanuel, which means what? God with us. Do you see it? Jesus said, go into all the world and make disciples. All authority in heaven and earth is given to me. Go. I am with you always to the end of the age. Do you see it? It's not confined to one place. It's the promise of God threaded throughout Scripture. And it's as true today as it was true back then. So I'm going to ask Chris to come and to play. And I'm going to ask you to stand. And prayerfully, as a believer, there may just be something God's putting in your heart, whatever is going on in your life. And pray for God to just help you to see beyond the physical realm this spiritual reality that's more real than the very air you breathe.